I think, as the Ambassador Smith said, this was a very unique summit in terms of what was promised not only to Ukraine, but the message that was sent by the allied leaders to the world, which is we are united, we have a strong message to deliver, and we stand by it. I think that was really sort of the aim of this administration, was to make sure that nobody misreads between the lines of any kind of misintentions or lack of motivation. And I think there's been a very strong message by the administration, but also by the allied leaders sort of hidden in it. And as Ambassador Smith has said, the alliance and the U.S. government have been working very increasingly on ensuring that all allies contribute equally. So to make sure that there's no doubt and no question about when whoever comes into the White House next on whether the U.S. commitment to NATO persists and whether the allies are contributing enough. So I do think that there is a positive story to be told about this summit in particular, and in particular about what allies as a collective are doing for the collective security.
Luka, one thing you could assume that former President Trump would react positively to is NATO's pushback against China. Of course, these leaders have basically labeled China as a, quote, decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. That, of course, prompting a sharp response from Beijing. But what can NATO as an organization and these leaders actually do to push back on this burgeoning defense partnership between China and Russia and the threat that it poses to the group overall?
Dan, I cannot emphasize how important this message is coming in the last communique from the summit, primarily because it is the first time that 32 allied countries have come together and recognized the threat posed by China. It's not only a normative threat as previously or a potential threat as we have previously discussed during the summit, but now we're talking, as you said, of a decisive enabler. This provides the opportunity not necessarily for NATO organization, but for allies individually or in different constellations, or for the EU in particular, to look upon that communique, to look upon that declaration and say, we now have basis and we have the agreement and the understanding collectively that something needs to be done. And we can now start working on identifying what are those steps to prevent China's contributions to the Russia's war in Ukraine. And I think what we likely could expect in some time to come are a combination of sanctions. Strongly worded statements are always gonna be on the agenda, especially in the diplomatic world, but also specific efforts to reassure and strengthen the rules-based international order that the allies have been emphasizing and talking so much about throughout this summit. And so I think it's really important to keep an eye on what is happening on this China front in particular, because there are a lot of potential consequences for it, not only for the Euro-Atlantic security, but also for the Indo-Pacific security, considering that China is an important player in the Indo-Pacific and has an important relationship and posture towards Taiwan. And so I think there's a lot at stake here, and in particular, when it comes to the security, broader security, but also the efforts that the allies are going to take. And I think also what's specific about that mention of China is that also the Washington Declaration mentions at one point in the same line Iran and North Korea, as well as as actively contributing against maintaining peace or achieving peace in Ukraine. And I think that's also an important parallel that the communique is making. So I think for us, the analysts, we need to keep an eye specifically on what's going to come in the months to come, primarily from organizations such as the European Union, but also the U.S. itself, to see if there are going to be any specific announcements of targeted sanctions towards specific technologies that are being used by Russia and are provided to China by China in order to attack Ukraine.